Last call, listeners. If you are ready to do body kindness for a year, I hope you'll join me in my exclusive Body Kindness Spiral Up Club. For just under $1 a day, you can get access to the two key components. One is a private password protected space where you get journaling prompts from me on how to learn and grow with body kindness. And the second is a moderated Facebook group where I will be there and others on the journey will be there too. So if you're looking for a place where everyone is included and welcome, and you want to focus on so much more than weight and appearance, and you want to practice what it means to be good to yourself, I hope you'll check out the Body Kindness Spiral Up Club. It's bodykindnessbook.com/spiral up.
Systems that tell us that our body needs to be a certain size and shape to be acceptable are doing that to benefit a select few. And they're doing that to reduce our autonomy so that we can't come and collect our own power.
That was Ijeoma Oluo, and she's the author of the new book, So You Want to Talk About Race, from Seal Press. She's also the editor-at-large at The Establishment, and her work has been featured in New York Magazine, The Guardian, The Washington Post, and more. She has talked about race on BBC, NPR, and CBS Evening News, as well as in countless offices, universities, conferences, and internet forums. And I'm so glad that she was able to give some time and join me on the Body Kindness podcast. When you were listening to some of the earlier episodes from this year, you know that Bernie and I were really kind of talking about ways that we can continue to expand body kindness and being good to ourselves and what that means for us as a society, as well as our families and communities. And we just heard wonderful podcast interviews about the beauty of being a misfit. And I think that this interview really dovetails in to a topic that really grew in importance in 2017 and is only continuing to grow in 2018. And that has to do with race and intersectionality and really understanding how that impacts, how is this going to help me feel better in my body? And why does this matter? And so listen to the whole conversation. Ijeoma really helps to bring it all home toward the end when I ask her to help us make sense of all of our topics. And it's really important for us to have these conversations. I would love to know what you think of this episode. You can email me. It's Rebecca@bodykindnessbook.com. And you can also join us in conversation in the Facebook group. Here's the show. Ijeoma, welcome to Body Kindness. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I want to start our conversation today with acknowledging my privileges, which I don't do often on the podcast. There was another podcast episode where I was talking with a fat activist, and we talked about the importance of acknowledging our privileges. So we did it on that show, and I feel like it is really important as we enter into our conversation today that I start with that. So I am a white cisgender female with a college education and health insurance. I have a home. I don't have to worry about food, and I've got disposable income and a job. And I would say the one thing how that's different from my past is growing up, I did not have health insurance and we had some government food assistance. So I have some experiences with lacking those privileges, but that's not at all what my life is like today. And so I wanted to start by sharing that with you.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask, because I know in your book, So You Want to Talk About Race, there is a few chapters in about privileges and about checking your privilege. So I wanted to start there and ask why acknowledging our privileges are important for us as a society and as a culture.
I think one of the main reasons why I've always been drawn to it and why it's helped me a lot is I think we have this narrative where we're always like, oh, walk a mile in that person's shoes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this idea that you would have to be able to empathize in order to respect someone and believe them and listen to them. And what I think it's important to acknowledge is that there are always limits to empathy. Empathy is still run through the filter of our own personal experience.
Mm.
And so what I like to kind of default to is just believing people and respecting people, and to be open to the ways in which our lived experience is actually stopping us from believing people and seeing other realities and other possibilities for how things work. And your privilege is one of the main roadblocks to that. And I think that, beyond putting yourself in someone's shoes, I think it's important to look at where you can't and then decide, whether or not you're going to take that leap and trust someone. But you can only do that if you stop and really do that exercise to look for what you've been missing. And exercises at looking in privilege really do help point that out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's reminding me of and it's dawning on me that I neglected to acknowledge it as a privilege just a second ago, but is being able-bodied. So I'm a health at every size dietitian and exercise physiologist. Like I wear this hat of self-care and nutrition and well-being. And I love helping people to see a weight inclusive aspect of that. But I recall, when I talk about movement, I'm always talking about the positives and doing something joyful. And I've really been reflecting that movement, regardless of size, it's not even a size related issue, right? At any size, you can have pain with movement and you can feel this disadvantage because everywhere you hear about movement and, just walk for joy. Well, if it hurts to take steps, then that's not accessible to me. And so that is something that recently in the realm of just even talking about non-weight loss related exercise, right? It's just naturally, we can reframe this and find ways of joyful movement. But, for able-bodied people, and you're also making the assumption that someone isn't dealing with pain. And I actually get a lot of questions from people who feel like they're trying to do yoga and the poses are being taught by mostly thin white women. And so they don't really feel like that they understand what it's like to be in their body, in their larger body, or, somebody who's like, yeah, I have thin privilege, but I have fibromyalgia, I have pain, and I actually hate exercise. So your recommendation doesn't really work for me.
Yeah, I do find too also that I think a lot of times there's this impulse, especially if you have a larger body, to kind of funnel that sort of, there's a lot of moralizing behind thinness, and people like to kind of treat thinness as a moral victory. And I think a lot of times people want to funnel that into activity and say, oh, you don't know me. I walk 10 miles a day. I do all of this. But
I'm a champion.
And while I think that you should do whatever brings you joy and be proud that you're doing things that bring you joy, to then ascribe this sort of morality to it, to be like, hey, I can't be this, but I can be this, is once again it's just shifting that hierarchy. And there's always going to be people who are going to be left out of that. And instead of telling people that they have the right to be proud of who they are because they're good people, because they're kind people, and there is no sort of physical activity, there is no sort of physical trait that's going to have, that's going to make you a better person. If something makes you happy, it can make you a happier person, but that's going to vary. And I think that a lot of times we shift that and say, no, I'm better. And it oftentimes is one of those, I'm one of the good ones. And we forget what we're actually saying on a broader scheme. And we're forgetting that we're actually still kind of reinforcing that very same messaging, that there are things about our body that we have to do to be acceptable people, to be good people. And if physical activity is done for any reason other than I would say your job, if you need it to survive, or something that brings you joy, and instead you're putting this kind of moral value to it or using it to kind of replace the moral value that people like to place on thinness, then you're really not actually changing the dialogue at all. You're just shifting that burden onto a different group of people.
Yeah, it reminds me of when I came to understand about healthism, right? And that like, oh, well, the most important thing you could be doing with any amount of spare time you have is working on your health.
Hmm.
Or, oh, okay, in the fat acceptance movement, well, okay, but as long as you're healthy, right? And
Yeah.
so I can relate to that sort of reframe. Well, nope, you're just painting the bar a different color. You still have that same bar of what makes you a good and worthy person is some sort of external criteria that judges good and bad. And that doesn't really liberate anybody.
Yeah.
Well, I would love to talk a little bit more about your wonderful book. So you want to talk about race, and just starting with, why did you write it?
I wrote it. My agent actually brought it to me first. I have an amazing agent, Lauren Abramo, and she was fired up. Like, she found me before anyone knew who I was. And she was like, have you ever
Fired
thought
up,
of...
ready to go.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. She was like, have you ever thought of writing a book? And I was like, nope. And she was like, I really think you should, give some advice on race. She's like, she was a fan of my work. That's when she came to me, and she was like, I feel like you explain things in a way that people hear it in a way they don't hear other things. And I was like, no, that doesn't sound like fun. Like, that really, I would really rather not. The work I do on race is done mostly out of necessity. And I was like, I don't want to sign up for 70,000 words of, basically, I don't want to become the white people whisperer. That doesn't sound like a good time. And I pretty much was like, no. And then she was like, well, can you think about it? So I said, okay, I'll think about it. And then in the meantime, as I was thinking about it over the coming weeks, I noticed, people do come to me a lot with advice on talking about race. And oftentimes in this kind of hidden secret way where they're, creating fake throwaway email accounts.
I'm ashamed to ask this, but ...
Exactly. And I think a lot of times, people think that, having over 400 years of race being one of the defining issues in our nation, that we would know what these terms are, that we would have better ways of talking about it, that we would know everything. And people are so ashamed to admit that they don't know a lot of these basic terms, that they don't know how to talk about what's happening. And I was answering these questions over and over and over. And then I said, well, maybe there is something here. And so I put out a couple calls on social media asking, what are some questions you have about race? What are some issues you have when you're talking about race? Just to see if, the response I get would inspire me in any way. And what I got that surprised me, and it shouldn't, and this was a great learning moment for me, was a lot of people of color who also were saying, these are the issues I'm having. These are the things I'm having trouble explaining. And that's when I knew I could write this book. Yeah. Because what I realized, the way that my brain works, part of the reason why this job has been so successful for me, why I've been able to do it so well, is I've always been kind of a systems thinker. I've always been able to kind of look holistically and kind of zero in on root problems that affect a lot of different areas of society. And that is a unique skill. And it's something that I think a lot of people don't have. I also have the privilege of higher education to kind of give terms and frameworks to these systems that you see. And what I realized is, we live in a country that has deliberately kept people from being able to discuss race. You can't uphold systems this brutal and this unfair if everyone knows what it is and everyone knows how to talk about it, and everyone has language for it, because that's where the brutality of it really is visible, and it's empowering to have language. And so, of course, it would be kept not only from those at the top of the pyramid who need that ignorance to continue to play along and not feel bad about how they're benefiting, but also from those who are being oppressed by it. And that's when I realized, I can write this book. And maybe also I won't have to keep answering the same question over and over again, which would also be really nice.
It's so funny to hear you say, I don't want to be the white people whisperer, because a planned question much later, I literally wrote down is how much I really loved reading your book. And I was characterizing it as questions that white people want to know but are afraid to ask. So and maybe that's just my identity. So it's like, oh, seeing it from my perspective, like this is so good. Like these are things that you don't want to admit that you don't know. Maybe you feel shame that you don't know, or you don't know how to approach a situation, or you're so afraid of doing the wrong thing, almost like perfectionism, right? You're so afraid of doing the wrong thing that you do nothing. But in the end, what you're doing is, as you just said, you're allowing the system that has power to stay in power and uphold it, because when you don't have a conversation, you can't create change.
Yeah. And I would say, from what I hear from a lot of white people who are reading the book, yes, they're very much relating to it in, I now have better vocabulary for this. Oh, I don't have to be afraid anymore of this conversation. I'm seeing more about it now. I'm more comfortable with it now. I feel like I can kind of move forward and start these conversations. What I hear often from people of color reading it, especially Black people, as I am a Black woman, so while I did try to increase diversity of representation in the book, of course, I'm writing from a perspective of a Black woman. What I'm hearing a lot from people of color and Black people is it's kind of helping alleviate that gaslighting. For if you are a person of color, oftentimes you have the very similar lack of vocabulary. We all have the same education system. We all have the same pop culture. We all come up in the same system. But what you have along with that is the actual lived experience that day in and day out that tells you something is so very, very wrong. And you don't have the words, and you don't have and in fact, all you have is language that tells you the opposite, that nothing is wrong. And if something's wrong, it's and deeply because it's hitting you. It's hitting you every day. And so, to have an experience, to have easy everyday words. I didn't write this to be something that I envisioned like PhD students arguing, in an advanced race studies class. And I'm not trying to be patronizing. I've taken advanced race studies classes. It's just not, I feel like there is work there for that if you want to kind of ruminate in that area. This I wrote because I feel like when you're going through your day, especially as a person of color, and you know that something's wrong and you have all of these hurts, and you don't have a way to effectively tell the people in your life this is hurting you and have a conversation that will work well, that will benefit you. All that does is add to the hurt. And so that's sort of, it's been interesting to see the difference in the feedback, because I'm definitely hearing those two sides. I definitely am hearing from white people reading it who are like, oh my gosh, I understand so much more. I'm really looking at my privilege differently. This is so great to be able to talk. And then I'm hearing from people of color who are saying, oh, I feel heard. I'm seeing myself. I feel, less like it's all in my head. And that to me is the most rewarding. But I think that both, the other reaction I get from white people is part of what helps facilitate that. Right? You also need other people to see that it's not all in your head, that it is real as well.
Yeah, I think, that it's such a powerful insight for you to share. And it makes me appreciate your work even more, because I found it to be very accessible. And you'd use a word about simplistic language, which is something that I wrote down too. Like we know that you could write that super high level, PhD student work, but would that be more accessible for a vast majority of people who are already busy and stressed and tired and exhausted and maybe don't need one more problem to have to try to solve? But if I can read this helpful, work of somebody I trust, who I know it gets it and is educated and is delivering it in an accessible way, you deliver it with compassion. And I also think you using a lot of your personal story to it made it easy and fun to read, but also it was kind of like we could have been having a conversation in a coffee shop together. And I found myself in my head responding to you as you were telling some of your story. And I think that's important for a reader to feel like that they can take a topic that is challenging and difficult, and you maybe feel shame for past mistakes, or, speaking as from the white woman side, and that could kind of want to do better and get some help and support for taking action. So I found myself saying like, thank you, this makes sense. This is something that I needed in order to take action and to make some, difference in how I move through the world and in the work that I do.
Oh, that's great to hear.
Yeah, no, seriously, thank you. I hope the listeners go out and pick it up. And I mean, anyone, if you talk to people, I think it's an important topic. It's not just, I mean, I'm a mom of 2 young girls, and without question, as I've learned and grown, I've known, don't, like, when we go to the store, and they're going to pick something out, I'm like, pick any toy. I would not stand in the way if they picked out a toy that had a black or brown body. I want them to pick what they see and would like to have. I actually take steps on books, like I love that they can find books where they're inspired by girls and women, but I bought a bilingual book, right? And where there's, people of color in it. And it's just like, I know I have limitations, but I also know that it's important to not just present to my white daughters one picture of what an accessible, inspirational woman should be. There's a really good children's book about Rosa Parks. And so buying that to help educate them, but also, at least I hope I'm making a difference to let them know that diversity and inclusivity is important in many ways. And I think if you don't know what you don't know, so you could be a parent and read this book and see, okay, how does this help? But you don't even have to have kids. You could be a teacher. You could be someone who just interacts with anyone who looks different than you, and you're going to get something out of it. And I think in a way that comes across as very trying to be, I don't know if neutral is the right word, but just educational and informative, but still has passion behind it. I wanted to ask you about the topic of intersectionality. And this is early on in the book, and you say that it's the number one requirement of all the work that you do. So I wondered if you could share for the listeners, what is intersectionality and why does it matter?
Sure, certainly. And I think it's important too when we talk about intersectionality, because I do believe that it's a term right now that has, I think in some ways actually kind of become a victim of white supremacy,
Okay.
because it's something that's been kind of removed from its source and used, I think, oftentimes to benefit the most privileged in a group. But intersectionality was a term actually coined by Kimberly Crenshaw many years ago. And it was really started first to address the way in which Black women were being left out of feminist movements, and not just left out, but oftentimes harmed by feminist movements that did not consider the realities of their life, the specific realities that they faced. And so oftentimes by continuing to center white women, and primarily wealthy white women, women of color and Black women specifically were being cut out, and oftentimes efforts made to improve things for women would be condescending or even harmful towards Black women and poor women. And it would oftentimes bake racism into feminist movements. And we've definitely seen that throughout history. So intersectionality was a term that was developed to really look at the way in which all of our identities intersect, and the fact that you can't cut your Blackness off from your womanhood. You can't be a woman in a room, in a feminist room, and a Black person in a room full of Black people. You are a Black woman in that space. And so the way in which your feminism interacts with your life also will affect how you're seen as a Black woman. And that you really do have to look at it. And if you want to help women, then you have to look at the specific needs of Black women. And then this was expanded next to class and Latinx women as well. And then from there, all women of color, and then looking at other, systems of oppression and other identities, such as queer identities, disabled identities as well. But the term itself started there. And so I think it's really important to always remember that, because oftentimes it's actually funny. Occasionally, someone will tell me that because I'm not addressing white women enough and their needs, that I'm lacking in intersectionality. And it's a thing I've seen. It's kind of, people take it and run, and it's been appropriated in a way that's, if I ever get a chance, if I'm ever fortunate enough to ask Kimberly Crenshaw, I think she would find it sad and maybe a little funny,
Yeah.
been like, oh, this is ours too. We can have this. But, it's very important, because oftentimes it is the nature of privilege to prioritize those at the top. And any social movement runs that risk. And if you're not making conscious efforts, if you've been at the top, your privilege, because it is unseen, because it is not challenged, it becomes what you view as normal and natural. If you're always the person heard in meetings, then that's normal to you. And being heard any less feels like an injustice. If you're, always the person whose needs are met, then having a few of them not met feels like an injustice, regardless of how everyone around you has been treated. And intersectionality means that you pause and say, I am not the only person in the room. My needs aren't the only needs. And if you have a movement, let's say, that is meant to help to help Black people. If you are not then looking and saying, what are the specific needs of poor Black people? What are the specific needs of disabled Black people? What are the specific needs of transgender Black people? You're not actually helping Black people. You're helping a very small subset. You're helping the most privileged within that community. And all you're doing is shifting that ladder, right? You're shifting that hierarchy, but the hierarchy still exists. You're saying, I'm going to lift up the top and leave the rest. And that's not what liberation looks like. You're just moving, you are fighting to become an oppressor, whether that's what you intend or not. And so without intersectionality, you will find yourself becoming an oppressor, no matter how great your intentions are. Because you are going to always leave out those with less privilege than you.
So let me ask a question. I'm gonna, this might not be the best example, but I'm just kind of trying to bring it back to maybe like what the body kindness listeners, like they're literally working on, I want to accept myself as I am, and I want to stop doing diets, stop trying to lose weight, right? And so they have thin privilege, right? And so they're doing, it's like body positivity, eat whatever you want, right? If they're not centering voices of fat women of color, right, then their movement for body positivity is being limiting and exclusive. And in order to really create big systemic change and truly take down diet culture, you need to have an intersectional lens and be more inclusive, which would include centering the voices of marginalized people and sharing their stuff that they might put out there online if they're doing that, or like verbalizing, I look up to this person, and is that kind of an example where that could apply to kind of help a listener think about, okay, well, what's one thing I could do to be more intersectional in, say, maybe the health and wellness space?
Yes, definitely. And I would say when we look especially at things like body positivity, there's a reason why there's a split between body positivity and fat acceptance, right? And oftentimes that falls on lines of privilege. And there is a difference between the two, but even within fat acceptance movements, there are levels of privilege that are unacknowledged. The truth is that most of the people that we hold up as kind of heroes of this movement are what oftentimes are termed little fats. Right? And they're usually
just
white
fat
women,
enough to fit in the fat category, but not super fat, like what Roxanne Gay would talk about.
Oh yeah, just maybe, a size or two below the national average for the average American woman, yeah, sure, and the amount of privilege in that to be applauding an hourglass figure of a conventionally attractive white woman who's just basically a sized up supermodel and saying that that's progress isn't. And also to, I think oftentimes the way in which we put pressure of saying you're going to wake up every day and you're going to love your body or you're failing at this movement. And it really depends on if you're going through your day and occasionally you get a little side eye, occasionally, and I know the message is devastating to people of all sizes. But the messaging around fatness, when you can't ride in an airplane comfortably, when every public event you go to, you have to wonder about seating, right? You have to wonder how many stairs they are. All of these things because the world has shown that they are hostile to your body and they will build actual physical barriers to your body.
Yeah.
Then starting with, what, if you're not ecstatic every single day, you're failing at this movement. Is an incredibly privileged place to come from. And to say, I see people who are kind of new to this and they'll post, oh my gosh, it's so great. This size is, this brand has extended their sizes to 16.
To 1X.
Yeah.
Thanks, but I know.
And all that is, and a lot of times you'll see, there's this outrage. The average, American is a woman is a size 18 now, 18, 20. And so then there's this weird outrage of like the fact, it's absurd, right? That many clothing lines won't actually clothe what is quote unquote the average American woman. But then to center that as the end goal, you're just basically saying, let's shift, what we view acceptable to this cutoff of 18, to this cutoff of the majority, and let's continue to leave everyone else behind. And so I do think it's important. And when we talk about things like health, and when we a lot of times talk around ending diet culture and instead like focusing on eating what gives you pleasure, right? And all of this forgets that financially, that's really not possible for a lot of people. And, if you live in a food desert, right, focusing on, life-giving whole foods and fresh vegetables and fruits, not really possible. And so I think it's really important that we always look at that, and also culturally maybe not as desirable, and that we look at all of this, right, and start listening to everyone and asking those who are going to be the first to lose in any kind of step forward, the first people left out, saying, no, what do you need? Start with them. And we start with the most marginalized people in our society, including our body positivity and fat acceptance movements. Our needs will be met eventually, right? My needs as a quote unquote little fat will be met eventually if I focus first on those who are always left out, right? On those whose needs basically to even be able to get through a day in public life are every day hampered by this society that is so incredibly hostile towards fat bodies. If I focus on them first, my needs would be more than taken care of, and I won't be oppressing and harming other people, And I think that it's important that we look at it that way.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And it's something that I really drew out of your book. And I want to say that it was in the part on privilege and checking your privilege and unexamined privilege. But you had this good frame where it was like, see it as an opportunity to do better and as an opportunity to do more. And I like that frame for it because I think that, as you were addressing in the book, like we tend to feel a lot of guilt about privilege, and then we end up shutting off our openness to why we need to examine our privilege. And that if you can look at it as, I care deeply about whether ending diet culture, say, right? Well, then, Jess Baker was the first one who said on my podcast, well, if you care about eradicating diet culture, you won't do it unless you work on fat activism, because nobody is going to be free until fat bodies are able to exist in peace. And it was like, ding, ding, ding. That kind of took me along further. And this idea of, you might start to, they might read the book, or you might start to kind of look at your stories and the topics, and it can be hard or painful to read and to try to look at as a frame of like, you're going to accomplish more of what you want if you are inclusive. And as you said, think about the people. Will this work for the people who need it the most? Because the solution you come up with will end up benefiting everyone else with more privilege than that. Is that the gist?
Yeah, definitely. I like to think of it oftentimes as a room you are in, right? Your privilege is a room you're in, and it's a room that other people aren't in. So while you can look at it and say, man, it really sucks that there aren't more people in it, you also say, but I'm here. And that's an opportunity, right? That's an opportunity to speak, to say things with the people who aren't here, and to reach out and pull other people in the room. You're there. If you're outside the room, you don't have that chance. And if you're in the room and you're not asking who's not here, you're giving up that chance. And so while, yes, you will feel a pang when you're examining your privilege, I think oftentimes because you start thinking of all of the times you didn't do something, and then you were a part of the problem. But then you can stop and say, but I'm here, and you're here, and now what are you going to do with it? And you can't have one without the other. You can't say, I'm going to ignore my privilege and then also do something great with it. Because, it's just not.
Maybe in your own mind, I'm accomplishing amazing things in my head, but yeah.
And it's a wonderful opportunity. Once you kind of get over that initial ping, then you have something to actually really be excited about. Once I started realizing, like, as a public speaker, that my not being disabled is an immense privilege, not only in, access to buildings, but the fact that, I just get a lot more opportunities. I am asked to speak on issues a lot of disabled people are not asked to speak on. And once I realized, it really hit me. It was a gut punch to realize I had gone that long without actively acknowledging it in my work. Like I even after, saying I'm going to put concrete efforts at looking at ableism in my writing and, looking at it at the establishment, and we're going to really try and address it. It still took me a while to realize that, like, how I was making my money, part of that was, I was benefiting from an extreme amount of privilege, and realizing that, I had gone years of sitting on panels talking about all sorts of feminist issues and issues on race. And not once had I asked, how many disabled people do you have on this panel? Or what sort of sign language interpreters do you have? Do we have descriptions for any images we're using in slides? That I had gone years without asking that question. Of course, I felt horrible, especially because this is my job. But then I was like, oh man, now I have this whole other set of opportunity to put my words into action and to actually work, and actually help make a difference because I'm in that room.
Yeah, it is. I can really relate to you within my own field as a registered dietitian. This was literally in the last 4 to 6 months, and I can't believe that it is such a recent epiphany, because I've been a dietitian for over a decade. And I remember, since first changing careers to go into nutrition, hearing about diversity needed in the field and hearing that it was something that our Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics cared about. And then I was going to be on a speaking panel about opening the doors to the right rooms in helping people get treatment for binge eating disorder. And I was examining our profession. And when I looked at the recent stats, we're basically almost all white women, like in the 97% category. And I'm thinking about it. I'm like, I live in Washington, D.C., and there's so much diversity. And I can probably count on my hands how many people of color I've had as clients. And I'm sure there are things that I'm not doing on my website and marketing and all this stuff, but it made me go, what am I actually doing to bring more diversity to the field? And that was the first time I publicly said something, and I started having some conversations, and I actually connected with a fellow dietitian. She's a female, she's a Black woman, and she came up to me and said, I was giving a talk about meeting clients where they are. It was so radical for dietitians, and all it was like meeting people where they are for their food preferences, and we don't have to be the food police. And she came up to thank me for including a Black woman with a photo in my case studies. And I just looked at her and said, the fact you even have to say thanks just goes to show you the depth of the problem. And we just kind of sidled together at the bar, got a drink, and just started talking one-on-one, openly and honestly about it. And she said, you're the first person that I ever felt remotely safe to say what I really want to say. And it was then I knew, kind of like that fire that you're talking about, I was like, okay, this is the exact situation of what you're learning about intersectionality, and that you are in a position of power. How can you two collaborate and work together to start to break down these barriers? Because everything that you care about in eradicating diet culture is held up by the fact that there is lack of diversity even within your own field. So I do think it might be hard for people to think about, but what can I do about it? But you don't necessarily know all the answers when you're opening up your mind to understanding, okay, here are all the things I need to understand and accept and embrace about race, but something will happen with you and it will click. And just like with you and your speaking and seeing that as an opportunity, that is what happened with me. And it's even simple things like finding other people who we think are open to the need for diversity and inclusivity. Another dietitian was like, we need more fat dietitians. I was like, yes, we do. And so it's like finding your people and just kind of coalescing around. So what are some actions that we can take? Because you got to start somewhere. And so, for example, Tamara and I are going to co-present in some dietetics speaking opportunities to just bring the issues to light in a different way. Because within our profession, like from the management membership organization or whatever, like they've been saying the same shit for a decade. And they'll keep doing it without any real change taking place.
That's wonderful. And I think everyone can start to look every day. You think what starts breaking down kind of the mysticism of it and the fatalism of it is when you look at everyday opportunities, when you look and say, how easy was this for me? Who would this be less easy for? How can I change that? You're going to find endless opportunities, no matter what your field. If you're working in accounting, it doesn't matter. Even in your social circles, you're going to find endless opportunities to actually make change and live your values.
Can you give a couple of points of where to start? Like, do you start with a one-on-one conversation? Do you go to HR? Do you ask for your diversity and inclusivity policy at work? Like, do you do something in the schools? Like, what would be a few action items that anybody could take if they know they want to do better?
I think, it really depends on where you are, where you're at. I would say definitely, like, my mom is a union officer. She works for the state. She has for about 20 years. And she's just, a 60-something-year-old white lady. And so she's made it an effort to, every union meeting to ask where they're making, race issues and diversity in hiring part of their union charter. And she asks every time she's in the room, she can say it and she won't be dismissed the way oftentimes people of color would in this, overwhelmingly white area. And she just keeps hounding them, and gets it added in and reaches out, asks questions, asks why they don't have more union reps of color, asks what their plans are to increase the staff and management of color. She just asked about increasing language because, she does work for a state agency that serves the public, of getting actual training and documentation around how to speak to genderqueer and transgender clients so that they're not feeling immediately abused by just the way that they're called up to a service window. And she can ask these things. And because of her privilege, she's not dismissed by people, who maybe haven't examined their bias. You can do things like, if you go into a restaurant and you have to go up 4 stairs and there's no access, you can easily ask the manager why they don't have better access. Why I haven't considered it. I'm a parent, I have 2 kids. Oftentimes I will get messages to come to PTA meetings and they'll be like at 9 a.m. And I'm like, hey, if you're wondering why you don't have any parents of color in PTA, it's not because these parents don't care about their kids. It's because they're at work. Maybe you should consider accessibility. And hey, maybe when you send these letters home with kids, you should consider printing in some more languages since we have a very diverse school, so that parents could actually read these notices and know that this is happening. Are you considering childcare needs for families that are going to be more likely to have a lot of young children in the house? These are things that the parents deserve to be just as involved, but also looking at, are you even paying attention to school board elections and the diversity of those elections and the platform of those elections? It's one of the most important votes you can make. The school to prison pipeline is devastating our Black and brown children and our disabled children. And a lot of that starts at the school board. So are you asking these people who want your vote, who maybe don't even hear from that many people in these local elections, are you saying, hey, what are you doing to reduce the amount of suspensions and expulsions for children of color? What are you doing to improve services to disabled children? What is your policy? What is your policy on suspensions and expulsions? What are your benchmarks to improve these metrics? What's your follow-up? I met with our city council. I looked at the site and I noticed that they had, for our police department, there were no clear outlines of how to file a complaint and how to reach out for help and who would be your advocate if you felt like you had been mistreated by our police department. And those are things that I was able to bring up, and they were like, oh, we didn't even notice. And they added a page. Right. And that's just an additional resource for people. I know how to escalate these things. It's my job. So I have no problem with that. Right. But because I do, that means it's going to be easier for me to look at it and notice what's missing. And these are all, everyday things that you can do. And if you're in a meeting and you notice that it's only, it's always like one white man or one, thin, attractive white woman who is asked what they think or who feels confident enough to raise their hand and say something, ask a person of color in a meeting what they think. If there aren't any in the meeting, ask why they're not in the meeting. If you have work get-togethers, oftentimes this is one of the things that's so demoralizing for employees of color and for disabled employees. Oftentimes these work get-togethers give no thought to cultural differences, to the general safety and accessibility of teammates. There were times when I worked in the corporate world where, where they would say, we're going to go to this great dive bar. It'll be fun. And it is a place where I, as a Black woman, would have never in my life felt comfortable or safe. But no one asked me. Wow. It's a fun place to go when you don't have to worry. And, there were times where they're like, we're going to walk a mile. It'll be quick. We can do it. Well, it's quick for some people. It's not for others.
And when you're constantly being excluded and not thought of like this, I mean, first of all, it's more labor you have to do as an individual, which is exhausting. But then it's also demoralizing, or you start to feel like, why bother? And, kind of like I'm being squeezed out of being able to exist as I am.
Definitely. And also if you already are not considering a population, there is some inherent bias you may not be aware of. That bias is also going to impact how you receive that sort of feedback. So I've seen it time and time again where, I will bring up something that may be racially insensitive, and the response I get will be very angry and defensive. And part of that is the bias built in. But then a white guy will stop in and say basically the same thing, and they'll go, oh, good point. I didn't think about it. Right. And so a lot of times, you have to remember that same bias that stops someone from asking also stops someone from hearing.
Wow. So I have a couple more questions. I know I at least wanted to get to one because I know we're getting short on time, but hopefully I could squeeze this one in here really quickly. But it has to do with your chapter on cultural appropriation. And so I want to talk about what it is and why it matters. And I'm kind of hoping to talk about it in the context of social media memes, because I used to kind of use whatever I thought was funny. And then sort of on my own, I started to scratch my own head. I was like, I don't know. I don't feel right using this meme of this Black woman. And it's funny and it's making me laugh, but something doesn't feel right. And then I remember reading a piece that kind of just said, yeah, that's not right. But then it just kind of left it open. And I found myself confused. Like for me, I personally decided, I was like, it's one thing if it's a cartoon meme, telling some sort of joke or an animal, but it's like when in doubt and I want to do oh, I know there's that Shirley Temple LOL and it's a little girl going giggle, giggle. And I was like, I don't, I feel like I could use that. But I see that happening a lot, especially among my white friends. And so I'm just curious, like maybe this is an area where we could be helpful for people just generally understanding cultural appropriation, but maybe also in the context of these memes where they might not be understanding, like, why is this not helpful?
Definitely. Okay. I would say part of the reason why I think cultural appropriation is a difficult topic is because we have this overwhelming narrative, especially in Western culture, right, that progress means sharing, right? And that you can't overappreciate a culture, that you can, that part of the American dream is this melting pot. But what we forget, of course, is the privilege built into that, and the privilege of being able to decide what you will or will not take from a culture is kind of reserved to a select few. I haven't had much of a choice of what I will or will not take from white culture. It's kind of always been shoved on me and shoved on any person of color in this country. And the idea of, I'm only going to take what serves me and leave the rest, oh my gosh, what a dream. That would be lovely. But I have never been able to. That's not the system I work in. And so it's kind of this general thing of people of color are every day punished for living in their bodies, punished for living their truths. And to come along and say, this makes me laugh, I'm going to take this piece and promote this piece, especially when you promote nothing else of our culture. And the people who initially do that are still ignored and punished for it, is nothing but an exercise of privilege. And it's a reduction of cultures of color. What interests me a lot when I see people posting a lot of memes of Black people is sometimes I wanted to say, do you actually know who that person is? Because that's a person. That's a person from a moment that's culturally relevant to a lot of the people of color sharing it, right? We watched that show. We've been watching that show. We know what that means. We didn't have to Google it.
Yeah, and it's a good point, because I feel like some people, oh, but that's a celebrity, like that's a notable person or a celebrity. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's helpful if you're not a person of color to share that meme.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean you can't appreciate it. And in fact, I recommend, if you're seeing, I feel like Black people on the internet have more fun than any other people on the internet. I mean, granted, at the same time, we have people calling us every name in the book and trying their best to force us off the internet. But we come together like we've always done to laugh together and try and make the best of things together. And we are very resourceful and hilarious and amazing, fun people. And so, yeah, I can understand if you're in the outs of that and you're watching this laugh fest go down with these memes and you're like, I want a piece of that. It doesn't mean you can't appreciate it. In fact, look at it, research it, find out what people are talking about. But some things aren't yours. And if you want it to be yours, I would instead focus on changing a system that only appreciates us when we're funny, that only appreciates us when we're entertaining, only appreciates us when we can be of use to white culture. Change that, because that's the way that we're going to end this conversation. That's the way that it's not going to be an issue anymore. It's not going to be an issue when Black people are valued for the entirety of who they are, and when all people of color are valued for the entirety of who they are, and not just when they can benefit white culture, when their very existence is enough, and when they are as represented as other cultures in our pop culture, in our academics, in our government, right? That's when it ends. That's when it doesn't matter. That's when there's no power dynamic to what you participate in and what you share. But until then, I mean, that's, I get it. It may not seem fair, but what's not fair is the system. It's not that you don't get to be in on every joke. It's the system. That means that that you may not be in on this joke, but people of color haven't been in on most of our systems of power and our structures and our economic system and our education system for all of the history of this country. That's where the unfairness lies.
Well, and it reminds me about like the role of being an ally, right? So you can appreciate it and feel that there's a benefit out of it without kind of like taking credit for getting to use this, So one of the things that I do is expand who I look up to, right? And diversify and follow work. It could be blogs or articles or, and it's like I choosing to reshare others on Instagram, right? And making sure you do the repost so it pulls their tag and originally what they said, and share what you like about it, why you think it's relevant or how it impacts you, and your interest in seeing more from this person, right? So they get the benefit of amplification from their hard work, and you get the benefit of being inspired by their work and then sharing with others how it helped you, like without taking anything away from anybody.
Definitely. And I would say too, if you're finding a meme, and oftentimes these are like little scenes from shows or movies or little bits of phrasing that are popular in culture, find what actually inspired that. Enjoy it. Share that. Share the work of creators of color instead of just the kind of narrowed down callback to it that they don't actually benefit from. Share the actual source. Say, hey, have you checked this out? I saw this meme. I thought it was really funny. Have you actually seen this show? Have you seen this movie? Have you heard this song? Did you know, here's an article about where this phrase comes from. This is really interesting. Share the actual work so that it actually benefits the people that have created that laugh that you just had, instead of just pulling this, screenshot, this kind of narrow view of it and benefiting it and looking like you're in on it. Actually get to know it and help to elevate it to areas that it doesn't have access to.
Yeah. I agree 100%. Before we go, and this is probably not fair asking for a top line answer, but for the listeners who might be following along and just saying, okay, so how does, kind of like in my day to day, I'm just trying to look in the mirror and not hate what I see. And I'm just trying to resist calling up Weight Watchers, in the new year. I'm just trying to work up the courage to get rid of the clothes that don't fit. And now you're throwing all this stuff on me and like, how does it help me today? Or why does it matter today? Can you help kind of sum up why for any listener who is trying to eradicate diet culture, work on body love and appreciation, get more out of life besides working on themselves? Can you try to, in your wonderful talent for simplicity, help people understand why this matters and why we should read the book and keep focusing on this to actually reach our own goals?
Definitely. I would say it's important to remember that all systems of power and privilege come first for our autonomy. And systems that tell us that our body needs to be a certain size and shape to be acceptable are doing that to benefit a select few. And they're doing that to reduce our autonomy so that we can't come and collect our own power. This system functions in many different ways. And the size of our body is one. The color of our skin, how we live in our skin is one. What we do with our body as women and femmes is another. These are all parts of systems of power and privilege. And if what you want to address is that system, because it will come for you in multiple ways. And if we say all we are concerned with is making sure that I feel better today, walking around in a larger body, the system is going to funnel that need for power into another system of oppression, because what it wants is to maintain its power over you. And so if you're not looking at the system, if you're not looking at oppression wherever you find it and fighting it, if you're not looking at your privilege and using it to destruct systems of oppression, it's going to find you somewhere else. And what you actually have to do is start pulling apart oppression and looking at it all as oppression. And that means that you can't let part of it go, and you can't say, I'm only going to stop where it impacts me. You're still leaving the system of oppression intact. And so it's really important to look at that and look at where we play into that system of oppression. So if you're fighting for your own liberation, but at the same time, you're not looking at how you are contributing to the oppression of others, you're not even fighting for your own liberation, because you're leaving a system in place that is wily and creative, and it's going to find its way back to you in another aspect of your life. So if you want to truly be free, that means that you're going to start first with your privilege and use it to actually pull apart pillars of oppression, and it will free you. And it will free others. But we have to realize that these things are all connected. And the way in which we tell Black people to do their hair in a way that's accessible is in very many ways the same way in which we tell fat people that they need to starve their bodies in order to be acceptable. And that we have to address that core oppression, and we have to find it in more than just the area that affects us right now if we ever want to have a free society.
That's beautiful. Well, the book is So You Want to Talk About Race, Ijeoma. It has been so wonderful to have you on the podcast today. Where can folks get in touch with you? And I assume the book is available everywhere.
Yes, it comes out next week and it's available for pre-order everywhere. And I highly recommend that people buy it and read it and use it in their day-to-day life. And you can definitely find me on social media. Everything is under my name. Twitter is probably the first place to look for me, but I do share everything I write on Twitter and Facebook.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
And that's our show. Let's continue this conversation in our Facebook group. Just search Body Kindness Podcast and ask to join the group. We also love ratings and reviews. Please subscribe to the Body Kindness Podcast and give us an honest rating and review. And if you can, tell a friend. If you'd like to support the podcast for the 2018 season, please donate at gofundme.com/bodykindness.